1, 2, 3. All good?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. I'm muting. So he is interested in contemporary political history, regional integration, minority issues, and security policy. Hasan's doctoral project is about the external policies of the autonomous polities like Greenland, the Faroes, and the Åland Islands in the Nordic region. And he is also affiliated with the Åland Islands Peace Institute and a European scholar within the 2022 to 23 cohort. The floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, can you hear me? And did I get the system to work as intended, or? All right. All right. So, today I'm briefly going to talk about the political process in how the Åland Islands became a part of the European Union. And before that, I need to set the scene for how Åland's autonomy functions and has functioned with regards to its international relevance. Now, the Åland Islands have been demilitarized since 1856 as a result of the Crimean War. This was Åland's first appearance in international politics as a subject to an international treaty, and this meant that fortifications on the Åland Islands were forbidden through an international agreement by the British, French, and the Russian Empire. It's been autonomous since 1921 as a part of the League of Nations decision, which was a response to the efforts of the Åland movement to reunify Åland with Sweden, and this was a reaction to the collapse of the Russian Empire and the pursuing instability in Finland. Not only the uncertainty regarding Finland's constitution, but also whether or not Finland would be aligned with and also the fact that Finland had a civil war, and the local Åland movement considered petitioning the Swedish government to intervene on their behalf as fellow Swedes. The Åland Islands were subject to the international politics again with the so-called Stockholm Plan to remilitarize the island in 1938 between Finland and Sweden. However, this didn't materialize when the Soviet Union objected, and local opposition was stated against this plan. After the Second World War, Åland once again was subject to certain rumors, in the sense that the Speaker of the Åland Parliament got wind of certain Finnish diplomats allegedly proposing to give the Soviet Union a base, or to propose that the Åland Islands be given to the Soviet Union instead of the base in Hangö, which was the original demand of the Soviet Union. And this caused the Speaker of Parliament to petition Sweden again. However, the Swedish government showed no interest. And the Autonomy Act was renewed in 1951, promptly granting Åland the right to its own flag and a clearer separation of powers between the state and the autonomous region. Åland joined the Nordic Council in 1970 alongside the Faroe Islands, which has been the main forum for paradiplomacy for Åland during the Cold War era, where any alignment with the European integration process on the continent was interpreted as something potentially harmful to Finland's and thereby Åland's relationship to the Soviet Union. And towards the end of the Cold War, the late 80s, Finland joins the Council of Europe in 1989 with the softening of relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. And with the establishment of the EEA, Finland takes one step further to the towards European integration, and the Autonomy Act of Åland was renewed one more time in 1991, which is relevant for our discussion today, as it included explicit articles that allows Åland to suspend the application of a treaty that contradicts Åland's Autonomy Act. Only Autonomy Act if the Åland Parliament does not consent to the application of that international treaty, and the Maastricht Treaty at the time was one such application, and so was the EEA agreement, which Åland actually joined in 1992 after a unanimous decision of the Parliament. And this was fairly uncontroversial because the EEA did not require the same level of sovereignty sharing as the European Union would. Now, in order to understand the further context of the decision of Åland to join the EU, we have to go back to the early 90s, and I'm going to start with the economic structure of Åland at the time. And these are statistics that I received from the Åland Statistics Institute, and it shows a relatively diversified economy, with the service sector being the largest amount of having the largest proportion of employees per sector. Regarding demographics, on Åland, usually there's a reference to three large regions, or three main regions of Åland. One is Mariehamn, the city, the capital. Then the rural regions on mainland Åland, and then the archipelago. And at that time, the archipelago and the rural Åland were constituted the majority of the population of Åland. Mariehamn had 10,429 people, and the rural regions had 12,200, and the archipelago roughly 2,400 at the time. This will explain the political dimension of, or rather the distribution of seats within the Åland Parliament. The largest party at the time was the Centre Party. It's a liberal agrarian party along the lines of the other Scandinavian centre parties. It belongs in the centre group in the Nordic Council and had 10 out of 30 MPs, and had the position of premier at the time. In second place, you have the Liberals, which have a mixture of social liberalism and market liberalism. They were the main opposition at the time. They had 7 seats. The FS was a liberal conservative party, and they had 6 seats. Social Democrats, which are traditionally weaker than their Nordic cousins, had 4 out of 10. And then you have a peculiarity to Ålandic politics, that is the unaligned coalition. They're a relatively loose group compared to the other parties when it comes to personal disagreements and ideology, but they, regarding the EU process, they've had a consistent conservative and nationalist line, very skeptical of transferring power to a supranational institution like the European Union. And the government at the time included the Centre Party, the Conservatives, and the Social Democrats, which gave them 20 out of 30 MPs, which is also the number needed to pass to accept an international treaty that would contravene Åland's Autonomy Act as per the Autonomy Act itself. It requires a 2/3 majority and hence 20 votes. Now, the road to EU, again, traditionally, Finland's Cold War neutrality meant that Åland's only option for external relations was the Nordic Council as a regional cooperation platform. And with the end of the Cold War, this allowed an opening for Åland and Finland to integrate into the larger European processes. And the main ideological and conceptual friction here was that the Åland autonomy established in 1921 was one based off of particularistic minority protection objective, which meant that one would give derivations from national and constitutional laws in order to protect the existence of the local population there. In Finland's case, the Swedish speakers on Åland, and the larger driving force of European integration, which demanded sameness, and oneness along the continent. And the EEA agreement was unanimously accepted by Åland, but the EU, through its sovereignty sharing, became much more problematic. And this became a reality that Åland had to deal with in March 1992, when Finland, following Sweden's application in October 91, applied for membership in the European Union. During this period, the Åland government was quite sensitive to keep the parliamentarians informed, as ultimately they had to vote on whether or not Åland would accept Finland's accession treaty. And the first of such communiques were, the Åland government sent a bunch of communiques, and the first one was sent to the parliament in March 1992, noting that this decision on the European Union was of a historical nature, and that it should be considered as such. A second report was sent to the Åland Parliament in August 1992, which set a number of fields of concerns that the Åland government considered to be in need of special regulation within the EU. One was the recognition of the demilitarization and neutralization of the islands. Two, the legislative authority of Åland in regard to community legislation, the unilingual Swedish-speaking status of Åland, restrictions on political participation of non-regional citizens in local and regional elections, restrictions regarding property ownership, restrictions regarding the right to trade on the islands, the right to have special commercial and tax law on Åland, and satisfactory participation of Ålandic representatives in the EU decision-making process. As you can see, these list of demands were quite broad and intensive, and the EU ambassador at the time, Eric Hayes, called this a very ambitious agenda. And it's good to note that the main difference from the Finnish position was it did not take an official yes or no line, but rather stated a line of demands and conditions in which the Åland's unique situation needed to be taken into account. Between 1992 and 1994, Åland sent 2 representatives to the Finnish delegation to the EU to negotiate the conditions of Finnish membership, and eventually this process ended with on the 22nd of February 1994, after a ministerial meeting in Brussels, and Åland was granted permanent derogations from community law on 2 fronts. One regarding the applications of the regional citizenship, so basically allowing Åland to continue to restrict non-Ålandic residents the right to own land and participate politically in the local system, and a derogation from the tax harmonization process, meaning that ferries to and from Åland were allowed to continue to sell tax-free products, as all the territory of Åland would be considered a third country in relation to the tax regimes of Finland and Sweden. And to justify all of this, the preamble of this so-called Åland Protocol included a formulation called stating that, considering the special status that Åland enjoys under international law, we give the following derogations. And from the EU side, the idea was so that Åland not constitute a precedent for future territories and nation states to make demands for extra derogations, to basically to not lose the goal of harmonization, which was the first thing and the main goal of the European Union to begin with. And of course, there was an additional level of disagreement with Finland here, because Åland's interpretation of this phrase, the special status that Åland enjoys under international law, included both demilitarization, neutralization, and the autonomy arrangement, which were 2 separate decisions from the League of Nations. However, the Finnish government always maintained that it strictly referred to the autonomy arrangement, as the derogations had nothing to do with demilitarization or neutralization. And this is more or less the EU position too, at least according to Eric Hayes. And however, the phrase was ambiguous enough that Åland was quite happy with the formulation. And the negotiations concluded by March 1994, and the political process of accepting the accession treaty began. So, in another message that the Åland government sent to the parliament, the Åland government made 2 further demands regarding the demand that Åland wanted additional taxation authority and adequate representation in the EU. And particularly on the latter point, it was justified that Åland and the Åland Parliament, just like the national parliaments within the European Union, had transferred parts of their sovereignty and legislative authority to the European institutions, and therefore Åland deserved some level of compensation to have its voice heard directly in Brussels. However, the EU always maintained that the distribution of European Parliament seats was a national issue and not something that Brussels would comment about. And then the decision was made to have a referendum in Finland, and Åland reacted by additionally wanting to by additionally voting on arranging another advisory referendum on the issue of European Union membership. And even this was quite divisive when it comes to Åland politics. It was voted 22-7 to arrange a separate referendum in which Finland would vote, Åland would vote after Finland and Sweden voted on the EU. And this was seen as certain MPs viewed it as unnecessary, and certain MPs didn't understand the point of having a advisory referendum, and the government was also split on it. It was voted 22-7, but the 7 MPs that dissented were all of the Social Democrats, 2 center MPs, and 1 conservative. So basically, the dissent was from the government, strictly from the government. The Åland government's idea of a separate referendum was primarily due to the fact that it didn't see any realistic possibility to obtain approval for EU membership, and what they wanted to have a wait-and-see policy towards Finland and Sweden's decisions. And in September 1994, the Finnish Supreme Court decided that it was within Åland's power to arrange such a referendum on the grounds that it was purely advisory. Now, the situation in the parliament was such that you needed at least 20 MPs to approve such a legal arrangement. Centre Party and its 10 MPs were quite split and ambiguous. 6 of the 10 MPs refused to take a clear position. 2 said they would vote against EU membership if certain conditions had not been met, and 1 said he would vote for no for Finland's part and yes for Åland's part due to the need of EU agricultural support. And 1 said that he already decided in favor of EU membership during the EEA process. The Liberals were generally positive-leaning, with certain reservations such as regarding fisheries, the common agricultural policy, and the policy choices of Finland and Sweden. The Conservatives were generally positive, and they stressed the economic aspects of EU's common market. However, 1 Conservative MP was strictly against transferring any legislative authority at the supranational level. The Social Democrats were generally positively leaning towards the EU, although they did have certain concerns with the welfare regimes in continental Europe and economic liberalization and how that might potentially affect the Nordic welfare state. And the unaligned coalition were clearly and unanimously against any transfer of power towards the EU, considering it backsliding of Åland's autonomy. In September 1994, the Åland Parliament, the Åland government sent another communique to the Parliament with still not a clear position in mind, and they repeated the idea that extended taxation authority and a separate member of European Parliament are preconditions for a positive attitude towards EU membership. And they also mentioned their concerns regarding EU's regional policy, which was still being negotiated, or at least the Finnish national package was being negotiated with the EU at the time. So they had 3 EU-related debates during this month on the 14th, the 21st, and the 28th. The parties largely maintained their positions from the summer, with the major exception of the Centre Party gravitating to a much more positive position towards the EU. So much so that the local newspaper at the time came out with a headline that Brussels is more generous towards us than Helsinki. Although, having read the debate, I have to say that this is a bit of a misleading headline. He actually says something along the lines that Brussels can afford to be more generous towards us than Helsinki. But the point was generally that the Centre Party kind of softened its position prior to the referendum that would take place in October. Yes, and even so, it wasn't enough to overcome differences within the Centre Party, having a rural base, very skeptical of centralized rule, and worried about the EU's agricultural policy. They did not recommend their members to vote in either direction. Same with the unaligned coalition. However, the Social Democrats, Liberals, and the Conservatives openly come in favor of EU membership prior to the referendum. And the results were as such. Åland was clearly more negatively inclined towards the EU than mainland Finland. But otherwise, the Ålandic result fits very neatly into the urban-rural divide in the Nordic region about EU policy. And the EU's driving pull in Finland regarding defense policy was almost completely absent on Åland. So, and being a primarily rural region, the rural interests kind of was slightly more prominent. Another element was probably effects of the Swedish campaign at the time, which was again more negative towards EU membership than Finland was. And I mean, we can still see that today with Sweden refusing to join EU cooperation on monetary policy, home and justice affairs, I believe, and some others, whereas the idea in Finland was to go to the center as much as possible. The Åland government sent another communique on the 8th of November 1994, where it officially now recommended that the Ålandic people vote yes in the second referendum. It did admit that it could not achieve its so-called threshold questions, that is additional taxation authority and the separate Ålandic MEP. It was also mentioned that the Åland government was of the definite opinion that the easing of tax formalities as a result of Åland's derogation should apply to all EU countries and not just between Åland and Finland. And additionally, the Åland government also stated that a special agreement with the EU would be needed if Åland were to reject EU membership. And they had contacted the Finnish Foreign Ministry to inquire if Finland was prepared to negotiate one. And the response they got was that it was technically possible to leave the EU, provided that all member states of the EU would consent to it. And despite this kind of opening the door of potential alternatives, the Åland government still argued that voting yes would be the only way forward, because a no vote would cause so much uncertainty and require too many additional negotiations. And this was the final debate on Åland before the vote of Sweden. And at this point, 17 out of 30 MPs had clearly stated that they were ready to vote for the EU, and the Centre Party was still split on the issue. Now with the Swedish referendum, the Swedes voted 52% against 48% to join the EU. And again, the largest local newspaper there argued that Åland took a step towards the EU, despite the fact that it wasn't Åland voting at all, but it was just the kind of cultural pull of Sweden and cultural, political, and economical, rather, pull of Sweden, and the idea that Finland is dependent on both Sweden and Finland to, in order to thrive, was implicit in the very headline. And this made it a lot easier for the Ålandic political leadership to argue in favor of membership as well. And then there was another debate, EU debate, after the Swedish vote about the potential effects of EU membership. So now we see a clear shift from whether or not we should join to how would European Union membership joined. All the parties that spoke in this session, that was the Centre, the Liberals, and the Unaligned, expressed different amounts of concerns regarding the common agricultural policy and fisheries policy and urbanization as a result of EU membership. However, the Centre and the Liberals still insisted that EU membership, that the EU would serve as a new platform for Åland to express its own interests and views, which the unaligned coalition was strictly not convinced of. And the second referendum, which was the Ålandic one, it was, when I was doing the research for this, it was quite anticlimactic to realize that at this point the second vote had kind of become a formality, with the Ålandic political leadership basically on the EU train already, and Finland and Sweden already decided to join, and actually no real plan in place for no result. So the results of this referendum was that 73.6% of people who turned out voted yes, and 26.4% voted no. However, turnout was only 49.1%, which basically meant that the no, the voter base for the no side didn't show up. And this was the headline of the Ålandic newspaper, and it basically says something like, "Get ready, EU, here we come." And the person on the left was the speaker at the time. She's a MP who was against membership, and that was the chief of the Centre Party. And the penultimate debate on EU membership took place on around the time of the Norwegian referendum, which was after the Swedish one and the Ålandic one. And it was basically amounted to a debate where, despite the lack of success of these so-called threshold questions, the Ålandic politicians became more and more acceptant of the reality of joining EU. So there was really a sense of the debate being a formality, and of course with Norway voting to remain outside the union, that caused a lot of disappointment for Åland in the sense that they lost a like-minded ally, and there was a lot of how to say, maybe disappointment, but also some sort of regret that Norway would weaken the Nordic voice within the European Union. And then the final decision to join the EU was taken on December 2nd, 1994. It was 24 MPs voted in favor and 4 voted against. 3 from the unaligned coalition who were never in favor of EU membership from the first place, and 1 conservative who broke the party line and voted that he would never accept transferring power to some alien organization in Brussels. He had a quite colorful argument about how people in the archipelago dislike getting ruled, being ruled from Mariehamn. So how should we accept getting ruled from Brussels? So it was a funny point. Yes. So in conclusion, Åland was successful in getting recognition of the international legal basis of its autonomy, whether or not their interpretation of this was in agreement with Finland or not, and the specific nature of its economy through the tax exemption. However, Åland was quite unsuccessful in getting its other political demands, such as additional taxation powers and the member of European Parliament. This is still an ongoing issue between Åland and Finland. It should be noted that it came up during the Lisbon Treaty, it came up after Brexit, and it's coming up again once due to the fact that Finland's getting an extra seat in the European Parliament. And to sum up, it still remains an outlier as a territorial autonomy that had the option to leave and chose to join anyway, because most territorial autonomies in the EU either didn't have the choice to formulate an opinion on EU membership or not, and were just included in the states' EU membership, or chose to leave, such as Åland's Nordic counterparts in Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And yes, that was it. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we should take some water before we ask questions.
Yeah.
Take home with you.
I think I'll get one, and yeah. It's fine. It happens. I should mute this. All right. Any other questions?
What do you think is the future of the remilitarization of Åland? Do you think it will happen? There has been some talk.
Yeah.
I noticed at least some talk in Finnish politics
Yeah.
about demands to end the demilitarization.
Yeah. I don't think it will go anywhere because, I mean, the foreign ministry actually conducted a review of the island's military, of the demilitarization and neutralization of the Åland Islands, and the result was that it's so legally entrenched that it's not worth the effort to unilaterally try anything to get rid of it. Additionally, they said that Sweden was against removing the demilitarization regime, so I don't think Finland has many options there, realistically speaking.
Why do you think that the Swedes do not?
I mean, you also have to remember that in 1856 it was basically to appease the Swedes that the French and the British basically forced Russia to accept the demilitarization. So I think they would rather have a guaranteed demilitarized and neutralized zone close to their capital rather than a potential kind of, I think for them it enhances their security by removing Åland from the picture and having a legal regime removing Åland from the picture. I think the logic probably goes somewhere along those lines. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Finland is quite dependent on shipping to get a lot of its goods in the economy, but it's hard to predict, and social sciences aren't necessarily the best predictors. But I think stability is in everyone's interest, and I'd like to believe that, and that's what the Finnish Foreign Ministry's report kind of found, that stability is better than, taking a leap of faith into the unknown, especially when your nearest ally doesn't support you. So I think it's, I don't see the Baltic Sea becoming too much of a problem because I think there's a lot of economic interests. But, you never know because, we live in interesting times. So how's that for a non-answer? Yep.
What do you think about the future with the Åland Islands and the EU membership? Do you have any ideas? I mean, there has now been a new election recently, and there has been some discussions to maybe withdraw from the EU, but do you see that as realistic? Because now it's kind of entrenched in everything.
Yeah, my impression is that if Åland had a time machine and went back, they would probably pick non-membership. That's the impression I get from talking to politicians and people who are involved in the process. However, I don't think the political leadership on Åland would spend the time and resources to find a way to push this. Like, I don't know if the popular support for leaving the EU would be strong enough on Åland for that to be a realistic political option.
Have there been polls about what the citizens think about membership?
Not that I can remember. Yeah.
Maybe some sort of, I don't remember now, also had some
Yeah.
sort of poll, but trust the institutions and authorities like the EU.
Do you feel like Åland and Finland would go on in circles, like forever about the taxes and the MEP?
Yes.
There will never be like a...
Unless something drastically happens, because I mean, you also have to remember that they've been renegotiating a new autonomy act for a decade or so. So I think that could easily be 2 decades or 3 decades if the current speed. And I mean, there seems to be a lack of public interest on both sides. So it's kind of a very elite-driven project, and then that there's no real political priority to work on this. So.
What leverage does Åland have in the negotiations?
I think you should ask Åland politicians. Well, I mean, with Greenland and the Faroe Islands, there's always this independence option. And Åland independence is not a popular position at all, to the point where the Independence Party just lost its own seat in the parliament. I don't know. I think the demilitarization and neutralization is probably one, if Finland agitates too much on that. But so far, Finnish political, the establishment has been quite pragmatic and have chosen not to make a huge deal out of it. So I think the status quo is probably going to endure for a while longer, until maybe an election causes some significant change on either the side or both sides. I don't see anything dramatic happening during this parliamentary term. Yeah. Any more?
They cannot write any exceptions there. No, it's just no, I don't think so. It's just oh, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for being here, and hi to everyone who's watching.